is only one effective solution to world poverty. It is the only solution that has ever worked for any nation or will ever work for any nation. This solution is evident from the economic development history of every wealthy nation of the world today. And this solution is consistent with the teachings of the Bible about productivity, work, Christian personal moral values, and government. My personal interest in this topic began when I began to reflect on Bible verses that tell us that we should care for the poor. In Galatians 2:10, Paul said, in summarizing what happened when he went to Jerusalem to check with the apostles in Jerusalem to see if his gospel was consistent with the apostles in Jerusalem, and he reported that they approved of his gospel, only, he said, they would have us remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. So connected to his description of what is important in the preaching of the gospel was a mention of the concern to care for the poor. And Psalm 41:1 says, "Blessed is the one who considers the poor. In the day of trouble, the Lord delivers him." God is pleased, many verses say. God is pleased when we care for the poor. Now, my friend Barry Asmus, a professional economist, and we believe that this new book, The Poverty of Nations, which I think you were given at registration, we believe that this new book will help people care for the poor in a well-informed, not just well-intentioned, but well-informed way, to show paths of help that will really bring genuine and long-term sustainable help to poor nations of the world. And the reason we think that, I could say that there are many books and articles written about how to help individual poor people. And there are organizations that are doing wonderful work around the world, Christian organizations, helping individual poor people in poor communities. But we could not find any book in the whole world that was written to a different question from a Christian perspective. And that question is, what can change at the level of a whole nation to bring it from poverty to greater prosperity? And so this book is not saying much of anything about how to help individual poor people or poor communities. There are many good things being done, but this is saying what needs to change at the level of the nation as a whole so that nations can be brought into greater prosperity. And when you think about it, the question of wealth and poverty is determined at the level of the entire nation by and large. And I have a map up here of the nations of the world according to per capita income. The wealthy nations are green: Australia, Northern Europe, Japan, South Korea, United States, Canada. Wealthy nations are green, high per capita income. Medium or middle per capita income nations are blue. That would be China, Russia, and much of Latin America. Poor countries are red, such as India. And the very poor countries are dark red. Pakistan, Bangladesh, much of sub-Saharan Africa. Haiti would be dark red. North Korea would be dark red. Very poor. And the question is, see, if I meet you and you say you're a citizen of Bangladesh or Uganda, I expect if you're an average person, you're very poor by the world standards. But if you say you're from Norway, or Switzerland, or Australia, or Canada, I think you're probably quite wealthy by the world standards. The nation in which someone lives is the primary determiner of wealth or poverty among the people of the world. Now, what factors lead to that result? That's the question that we tried to ask in this book. We don't know any other book in the world that has done this from a Christian perspective at the level of the whole nation. Imagine for a minute that you're an influential leader in a poor country, and you want to help your nation. Maybe you're a government official. Maybe you're a professor. Maybe you're a pastor or a priest. And you want to help your nation escape from poverty, but every time you try to find a solution, you face a myriad of conflicting kinds of advice. People will tell you in books and in personal conversation, in order to get from poverty to prosperity in your nation, you need to get more foreign aid. You need to lobby for debt forgiveness. You need to discover more natural resources. No, you need to redistribute money from the rich to the poor in your country. No, you need to print more money to get the economy growing. No, you should blame colonialism or international trade patterns. No, you should promote fair trade coffee and buy it at Starbucks. And our book is saying, stop. stop. Wait a minute. Before you can answer any of those questions, we need to understand two basic economic concepts. And the first one is per capita income. Per capita means per person. And the per capita income is basically the standard measure of whether a country is rich or poor. This chart was determined by evaluating the per capita income of the various nations of the world. You take the total economic production, divide by the number of people, and that gives you per capita income. And the second concept to understand is GDP, or gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total measure of the value of all the goods and services produced and sold in a nation in a given year. It's the value of all the pairs of shoes that were made and sold in the market, the shirts that were made, the apples and tomatoes that were grown, the cars and bicycles that were produced. And it includes the value of the classes that were taught where a teacher was paid, or the mechanical repair on a car and the mechanic was paid, goods and services. When you add it all up, that's the gross domestic product of a nation. Now, the size of a nation's gross domestic product is the main factor that determines its wealth or poverty. Let me give you, in very round numbers, a general example. Honduras. The gross domestic product of Honduras Can you see this? Yes, all right. The gross domestic product is $36 billion. The number of people in Honduras is 8 million. 8 million people divided into $36 billion is $4,500 per capita income. That means that Honduras is quite poor. Now imagine for a moment if Honduras could double its per capita income to $72 billion. 72 billion divided by 8 million people equals $9,000 per capita income. All of a sudden, Honduras has moved into the blue or middle income category on the map. $9,000 is about equal to the per capita income of China. Mexico is $15,000. Just to give you some others by way of comparison. Japan, $36,000. Germany, $39,000. The United States, $50,000. Norway, $55,000. Do we have any Norwegians here in the room? Or will you admit it? But Haiti is 1,300. Uganda, 1,400. Pakistan, $2,900, compared with Norway of 55,000. So those are poor countries. And if the gross domestic product, the total amount of goods and services produced in a nation, can be increased, then the nation begins to rise from poverty to prosperity. Therefore, the focus of efforts to overcome poverty, your goal, if you are a leader in a poor country, your goal, your laser focus must be on this one goal: increasing the production of goods and services in your country. Increasing how much your factories produce, increasing the products that your farms produce. It's the only goal that will bring you out of poverty. So the most important question is, what will increase the GDP of your country, the gross domestic product? And our book really addresses that and finds there are 79 factors within a nation that have historically increased GDP, or if they're absent, they will keep a country in poverty and keep its GDP low. These factors fall in three categories: the economic system, the government laws, and the cultural beliefs and values in a nation. Now, I want to mention, before I talk about those 79 factors, I want to mention other goals that people have suggested and why I think they are mistaken. First, foreign aid. No nation in history has ever escaped poverty by means of foreign aid. Foreign aid given through the governments of poor nations usually does more harm than good because it entrenches corrupt rulers in power. It fattens their personal bank accounts, and it foments or promotes civil wars over control of the nation's treasury and all the aid money. Economists such as William Easterly, Paul Collier, and Dambisa Moyo and others have written extensively about the harmful results of foreign aid, and we mentioned those in our book. In fact, we also mention a symposium on foreign aid led by Abhijit Banerjee, professor of economics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. There was a symposium of world experts on foreign aid, and they got together and published a collection of essays called Making Aid Work. And in this book, the editor of the book says, basically, there is much current confusion in the academic world on how foreign aid could work. He said, instead of a handful and clear-cut and simple laws that tell us what to do and what to expect, we have 100 competing different tendencies and possibilities of uncertain strength and quite often direction with little guidance on how to add them up. We can explain every fact many times over with the result that there is very little left that we can both strongly believe on and act upon. This is the conclusion of a meeting of the experts on foreign aid for the whole world. There is very little left that we can both believe strongly and act upon. Robert Bates, government professor at Harvard, he said, in truth, there is no theory of development that is logically compelling and demonstrably valid. One good indicator of this is the very abundance of theories. And then he says, the field of development responds less to evidence than to political fashion. The Bible supports the idea that foreign aid will not solve the problem of poverty, that nations rather must produce their own prosperity. In fact, when Israel came into the Promised Land, God did not promise them perennial donations of riches from other nations. He rather promised them hills filled with iron and copper, which they would have to dig and refine. That's work. And he promised them fields of vines and fig trees, which they would have to tend and harvest every year. In other words, God's blessing of prosperity would come by productive work. Deuteronomy 8, 7-10. They would have to produce their own prosperity. The people of Israel did receive some foreign aid. We could call it heavenly or celestial foreign aid in terms of the manna from heaven. But the manna ceased on the day after they ate from the first harvest in the Promised Land, Joshua 5:12. Even the poor people in Israel had to work for what they got by gathering the gleanings that were left at the edges of the fields, Leviticus 19, 9-10. There is no thought in the Bible that poor people or poor nations were to become dependent on donations from others year after year. To repeat, no nation has ever escaped poverty by means of foreign aid. Now, parentheses, someone might say, what about the Marshall Plan after World War II, where Germany and some of the other nations were reconstructed? That was not bringing a poor nation from poverty to prosperity. That was restoring the infrastructure of a wealthy nation that had been that had been damaged by war, and it already had an educated population and educational system and many other factors that made it a wealth nation that had war damage, but it wasn't bringing a poor country from poverty to prosperity. Now, the question comes up, what about sending charitable gifts of food or medical help to poor countries through your church or through a charitable organization? Like we have Food for the Hungry in our Phoenix area, and Margaret and I give to support that. Such charitable gifts are good, and they're important because they meet an urgent need, but they are addressing the symptom, not the cause. Let me explain. The symptom is that someone is hungry. If you give him food, you help the person. But the cause is the poor nation is not producing enough of its own food. That's the cause, and that must be solved. The symptom is someone is sick. And if you send medical aid or a doctor, you help that urgent need. But the underlying cause is the nation is not producing enough of its own medical care. So these charitable gifts are not what I mean when I say foreign aid doesn't work. I mean aid from government to government that's channeled by the leaders in the poor country. Charitable aid that goes immediately to the local village or the local poor person, that's helpful. But it doesn't solve the long-term problem. How can the country produce its own food and its own medical care, its own prosperity? And there's a danger that if medical and food aid goes on year after year after year after year after year, it can create dependency, a sense of dependency. So foreign aid isn't the solution. Number two, debt forgiveness is not the solution. Forgiveness of a poor nation's debts is not the answer because it is just more foreign aid carried out in a two-step process. First the loan, then cancel the loan. Not the correct solution. What about natural resources? Discovering and extracting more natural resources can be of some help, and Norway is an example where North Sea oil has been of help to the economy, certainly. But too often, and in too many nations, abundant natural resources can become a curse because they can lead to civil wars to gain control of the government and then the control of immense money from oil or minerals. And in addition, I think we can conclude that natural resources are not the answer because many African and Latin American countries have immense natural resources, but they remain poor. But nations such as Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Switzerland all lack significant resources, and they've become wealthy by producing creative economies, productive economies. They've produced their own prosperity. So foreign aid doesn't work. Debt forgiveness doesn't work. Natural resources aren't the answer. Number four, transferring goods from one person to another doesn't work. What is your name? Lavino and Christy. If Lavino has 2 shirts and Christy has none, and he gives 1 shirt to Christy, that's a good deed. John the Baptist says it's good. Let one who has 2 shirts give to one who has none. But it does nothing to increase the GDP of the country. The country has produced the same before and after you transferred the shirt. So transferring goods from one person to another doesn't increase GDP. Printing money doesn't increase GDP because money itself is not a product of value. You cannot eat money. You cannot wear it. You cannot drive it to town. You cannot plant it. You can't put it over your head to protect you from the sun or the rain. You can use money to buy other things because it's a medium of exchange, but it's not a product of value in itself. Printing money doesn't increase the GDP. Number 6, blaming poverty on outside factors doesn't increase GDP. I know people can discuss endlessly the impact of colonialism, the world economic system, the world market prices for goods, world trade agreements, multinational corporations, the role of rich nations. The analysis of these is complex and it takes up many pages in our book. I can't go into that now, but the question for a poor nation right now is, what can you do looking forward? Even if you can't, and it's not likely that you can have much impact, you can't have any impact on the past, and even if you can't have much impact on foreign trade organizations or things like that, the question is, what can your nation do now looking forward to continually increase your production of goods and services? The main point is that the goal for overcoming poverty must be to produce more goods and services. That will increase GDP. It will increase per capita income. It will bring a nation out of poverty. The next question is, has this ever happened? Oh yes, certainly. It is the only way any nation has ever become wealthy. If I could go back from 2012 to 1812 or 1862, 200, 250 years. Do you know what color this map would be? 250 years ago, the whole map would be dark red, very poor, under $3,000 per year per capita income. That was the state of humanity for most of history. There were a few wealthy kings and noble families. There were a very few wealthy merchants, but most people lived in ordinary, everyday poverty. Then suddenly, beginning with the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom in 1770 or so, and continuing on for the next 100 years, England and then other countries began to produce much more. They started with cotton, and then other textiles, and then other products. And their factories produced more, their farms produced more, their per capita income doubled, quadrupled, and then kept on increasing. And much of Northern Europe followed that example, and much of North America followed that example. The same pattern has continued in the modern era. Think, for instance, about Japan. In 1900, Japan was a poor agricultural economy. But in the late 20th century, it grew to the second largest economy in the world by manufacturing cars, computers, TVs, cameras, steel, ships. Even more recently, take the example of South Korea. South Korea in 1950. South Korea was one of the poorest nations in the world, poorer than most of the nations in sub-Saharan Africa. But South Korea today is the 12th richest nation in the world. Why? It has gained that status by manufacturing products like TVs, cars, and microwaves. Or take Chile. Chile here in South America. It will be the first country in South America, independent country in South America, to move into the green or wealthy category. And it began to move out of poverty in the 1970s by producing abundant fruits and vegetables for export, often to North American markets and perhaps even to European markets, I don't know. China is growing by producing millions of small manufactured goods. Every nation that has escaped from poverty has done so by producing its own prosperity. I'm going to pause just 1 minute as I'm saying the goal has to be to increase GDP and per capita income. You will notice that I haven't said anything yet about Saudi Arabia and Oman. They have high per capita income, but they prove that per capita income doesn't tell us everything about a nation because it doesn't tell us how the income is distributed. And in those Arab oil-rich countries, there are a few members of the wealthy family who control all the oil wealth and the prosperity. They have yachts and airplanes and palaces, and most of the population lives in poverty. So per capita income doesn't tell us everything. It doesn't tell us about the distribution of income. But still, while per capita income remains low, a country remains largely poor. And so the main goal has to be to increase per capita income. And then speaking as a Christian theology professor, I have to say also that I believe that producing prosperity, creating wealth in a nation, is not morally evil, and I don't think it's morally neutral. I don't think it should be just called materialism. I think it's a morally positive activity. I think it's a divinely commanded activity implied by God's command to Adam and Eve to subdue the earth and have dominion over it. And I think that the ability to create products of value from the earth is a uniquely human activity that is a reflection of our creation as God's creatures made in His image. How does that happen? How do people take the resources of the earth and add new value? Let me give you an example. I walked into a shop near our home recently, and they were selling these plastic discs. You might think this is 5 cents worth of plastic. I don't know what you might use it for. You could put it on, it might be a small ashtray if I smoked, but I don't smoke, and so it's sort of worthless. But I saw a man that was putting these in a machine, And when he put one in the machine, out came the right lens for my glasses, $100 lens. And he put another one in the machine, out came another lens, another $100 lens from 5 cents worth of plastic. He created new value in the world that never existed before. That's a human characteristic. It happens in a simple way, too. If a woman in a poor country takes a piece of cloth that she paid $3 for, and she sews it into a shirt that she sells in the market for $13, she has added $10 to the gross domestic product of her country. She has added $10 of value to the world's resources. Human beings, alone among God's creatures, can add value to the resources of creation, value through products that are useful for human beings. So how can that be done? How can countries increase their gross domestic product? Our book lists 79 factors, and we've given out, when we passed out this book, we gave out this outline, this summary of 79 factors. I don't know if you have this, that you got at registration. It's an insert that lists, it's in the back of the book, it's in an appendix. If you have the book, you also have it. But it lists 79 factors. 6 of them are the economic system, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then 38 of them are the government, and 35 of them are cultural values. I'm going to just talk on a few of these for a few minutes, and then I want to open up the floor for questions. The economic system is crucial for moving from poverty to prosperity. We go through a survey of all the economic systems that have been used in the history of the world, at least the major ones that we were aware of. And we find that the only economic system that can ever produce sustained prosperity is a free market system. A free market system means a system in which individual people, not the government, decide what is bought and sold and what is produced. That's a free market system. Now, we say in order to have a true free market system, you have to protect people from violations of law. You have to protect people from theft and fraud and breaking contracts. There's some protection, because if I steal your computer from you, it's not individuals being free to decide. It's not a free market anymore. It's a theft market. And so by free market system, we don't mean anarchy or the absence of rule of law. We mean free market with rule of law, and protected property rights are very important, because as long as there is tribal ownership of property, no nation ever rises out of poverty. There are traditions of tribal ownership still continuing in many regions of sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, we have tribal ownership of property in Arizona, in several parts of the United States where I live, because the American Indians or Native Americans still, by and large, have tribal ownership. And I took a picture out the airplane window of where we live one day. Here we go. This is Scottsdale, Arizona, where Margaret and I live. This is Highway 101 that we drive down to get to the airport. This is commercial property with stores and shopping malls. This is commercial property and a hospital. This is residential property, but this property, a real estate agent told me, is now selling for $500,000 per acre, $500,000. 1 inch from it is tribal land owned by a Native American tribe, totally barren. The economic productivity of this tribal land is 0. And there are no fences or stop signs or barriers. You can drive over onto this tribal land, and there are houses, but these people live in abject poverty. Now, there's a casino here, but that's owned by the tribal leaders largely, controlled by them. No nation will rise from poverty while it maintains tribal ownership, and 7 uncles and 3 aunts and 4 cousins all have a say when you try to buy or sell a piece of property. It just doesn't work. The ownership of private property and the documented ownership of private property is essential to a functioning free market system. so that people can own property, begin to accumulate value in it, what we call capital, and then they can invest in business and grow businesses. A free market system will include private property, will include easily documented ownership of property. In many poor countries, I have a picture here. We visited Lima, Peru. Oh, just let me find the picture just a minute. I'm sorry, I've lost the picture. Many poor countries of the world, poor people have squatters' rights, but it's impossible for them to obtain documented ownership of property. And the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto has studied this extensively and said because in many poor countries, the government leaders and the wealthy property owners maintain tight control, so it's basically impossible for the poor people to obtain ownership of even the property on which they live for years. So they have no verifiable address and they can't establish credit or grow in their prosperity. A free market system needs a stable currency, it needs low taxes, and yet, sometimes when we say we need a free market economy, people object, wait a minute, isn't there some government control in all nations of the world? How can you talk about a free market economy? Aren't all economies mixed? So aren't you just talking about mixed economies of various sorts? And our response is to say, for 20 years now, this organization called the Heritage Foundation, in cooperation with the Wall Street Journal, has put out an index of economic freedom. It's published every year, and it lists the countries of the world according to their score in economic freedom. Number one, the score is based on 100 points. 100 is perfect freedom. The area of the world, it isn't quite an independent country now, but it has such an independent economy, it's counted independent. The highest nation in the world has a score of 90 out of 100, Hong Kong. Second, Singapore, 89. Then Australia, Switzerland, New Zealand, Canada, Chile, Mauritius, Ireland, Denmark, Estonia. Sadly, my own country, the United States, has been dropping year after year. Today, it scores only 75 out of 100 because of higher taxes, excessive government regulation, insecure property rights, in some cases because of government lawsuits and policies and other things. So it ranks 12th in the world. United Kingdom, 14th. Germany, 18th. Sweden, 20th. Anyway, we say probably those top 20 or even the top 20 economies of the world, or so, 21 perhaps, would be called free market economies. Below that, they would be moderately free or mostly unfree or then repressed. And the lowest scores in the world are 175th Venezuela, 176th Zimbabwe, 177th Cuba, and 178th North Korea, which is given a score of 1 out of 100. Tragic. So a nation should be annually improving its score on Index of Economic Freedom. And it evaluates different factors. It evaluates rule of law, government corruption, government size, level of taxation, business freedom, labor freedom, monetary freedom, and trade freedom, investment freedom, financial freedom. So it evaluates them on the basis of 10 categories and gives a score. So free market economy is one that basically is a score of 75 or above or something like that in that index of economic freedom. Stable currency, low taxes, and increasing score on the index of economic freedom. Let me just see if I can, so that's the economic system, a free market system with rule of law. The government system has to be one in which the government leaders rule for the benefit of the people as a whole, rather than the benefit of themselves and their friends. You're laughing. Yeah, you think it can't happen?
Well, I know it can.
Yes, it can happen. But maybe you know yourself of examples of poor countries where the leaders are fabulously wealthy and they have their hands continually in the national treasury. That is contrary to Romans 13:4, where it says the government official is supposed to be, in God's plan, is supposed to be God's servant for your good. The responsibility of a government official before God is to serve for the good of the people as a whole. We have 38 factors that will tend to guarantee or protect this benefit of the people as a whole from government, as opposed to government for the benefit of the rulers. Rule of law, where even the rulers are subject to the rule of law. Fair court system, where the court doesn't show favoritism or bias. There's much in Scripture about judging fairly between rich and poor. Absence of bribery and corruption in government offices. Protection against violation of contracts. And freedom to travel and transport goods. I'll tell you one other example here. There's a man named Robert Guest. He was the African editor for The Economist magazine. And now I'm not sure I can find Cameroon. I think Cameroon is just in this part of West. Is that Cameroon? Right there? Cameroon. Well, Robert Guest decided to try an experiment. He would ride on a delivery truck in Cameroon to see how long it took them to deliver a load of goods. He got on the truck in Douala, the port city, and they were supposed to go, now this is going to be miles, you'll have to convert to kilometers, 300 miles, I guess that's 500 kilometers inland. On a German Autobahn, how long would it take to go 500 kilometers? 3 or 4 hours, okay. It would take 5 to 6 hours in the United States, but it would be a number of hours. It should have taken him 1.5 days, about 30 or 36 hours if the roads were working right in Cameroon. But it took him 4 days. And he was stopped, he and the driver were stopped 47 times at different checkpoints where they would encounter strips of wood across the roadway with nails protruding up through them, and the people at the checkpoint wouldn't move the barrier out of the way until they had an inspection. And inevitably there was some violation and they had to pay for the fine. So Robert Guest says, the best explanation for why this happens is at checkpoint number 31, where the gendarme had invented a new law saying you could not carry passengers in trucks. When it was put to him that the law he was citing did not exist, he patted his holster and said, "Do you have a gun?" "No." "Well, I have a gun, so I know the rules." Well, they paid the fine. Needless to say, I didn't mention, their cargo was 30,000 bottles of Guinness beer. They arrived with 20,000 bottles of beer. This is the absence of rule of law in a nation. I don't think you imagine that, at least in most of your countries, someone could set up a roadblock like this and get away with it. The police would come and take them away. But in Cameroon, it happens. Now, what has happened to everybody who wants to buy a bottle of beer, Guinness beer, in Cameroon? The price is 50% higher because they've lost a third of their cargo. And the cost is increased by the labor cost of the driver's time, and the cost of everything in the nation is increased because the people armed at the roadblocks are not doing any good productive work with their time. They could be building or growing or doing something useful. So it's total harm to the economic development of the nation, but it's a lack of freedom to travel and transport goods anywhere within the nation. Interestingly, Germany had such tolls on roads and rivers until 1834. England had a great advantage in the Industrial Revolution. There were no tolls. They had freedom of travel and trade throughout the country, a big market. freedom to start businesses, freedom to hire and fire, freedom for women as well as men, freedom for all races, freedom to become wealthy by legal means. People need to see and know personally some poor people who, by hard work and diligence and honesty, have become rich, not by robbery or bribery or lottery, but by producing products of value that other people want to buy. At least that's the government system, protecting many freedoms and rule of law. And finally, the values of a system. We list 35 values that are consistent with biblical teachings. It's not a surprise that the Industrial Revolution and the immense economic development that followed it came in England, then in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, then in Canada and the United States, countries largely influenced by the Protestant Reformation. Because, and Catholics today would affirm many of these principles much more than they did at the time of the Reformation as well. But if the society in general believes there is a God who holds all people accountable for their actions, it tends to promote honesty and good quality of work. If they believe that God approves of being able to read, so there's high literacy in the country, why did Protestants want both men and women to be able, why did they want both boys and girls to be able to read? To read the Bible, yes, Janos. Pursuing one's job as a calling from God, being honest and diligent at work because you're working for the Lord and not men, believing that God approves of material productivity from the earth, believing that God wants you to tell the truth. That's immensely valuable for business transactions and for economic productivity. Believing that God wants you not to steal someone else's goods. That's immensely valuable to the productivity of an economy. Believing that the earth is here for the use and benefit of human beings. Finally, and I'll close with these, the last 2 points on cultural values. We think it is important that the society count family, friends, and joy in life as more important than material wealth. And finally, that the society counts spiritual well-being and a relationship with God as more important than material wealth. Barry Asmus, my co-author, and I do not believe that material prosperity is the most important issue in the world. It is not. Jesus taught that love for God and love for neighbor are the 2 greatest commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if we're talking about how to solve world poverty, then the solution can only come through increased economic productivity within poor nations themselves. Conclusion. There's only one solution, effective solution to world poverty. Poor nations must produce their own prosperity. The good news is that many poor nations are already doing this. The better news is that all poor nations are able to do this. But tragically today, many millions of poor people around the world remain trapped in lifelong poverty. It is not because people in other nations are rich. It is because these poor nations are living under oppression. They are oppressed by economic systems that cannot bring prosperity except for a tiny despotic elite. They are oppressed by laws and governments that cannot bring prosperity except for a tiny group of privileged rulers. And they are oppressed by dominant cultural beliefs and values that perpetuate poverty and cannot produce prosperity. We believe that this book, The Poverty of Nations, gives hope because it shows heroic leaders in poor countries a pathway. It shows them 79 specific steps, any one of which, if they can improve on, will enable them increasingly to set their people free from these oppressions so that they will increasingly produce their own prosperity. This is, we believe, the only genuine solution to world poverty.